In this video, we'll introduce the new partitioning feature released with Infusion Design Center version 3.8. I've pre-built a file so as to expedite the presentation. I've added a couple of floors using the standard method. I've also added a ballroom, but for this I didn't use the standard method. Rather, I used a new type of area called a partitioned area rather than the standard area. With this new partition area selected, there is a new partition tab, and here we define the configuration of the space. I've made it a 2 by 2, resulting in 4 partition rooms with 4 movable partition walls. I've given each room a name. And the grid tab, we can see the elements that we're used to seeing in this view, and I've added to each of the 4 rooms 3 loads each: recessed, cove, and chandelier. So consider how we anticipate a button within a partition room to operate. Let's say we have a button designed to operate the cove lights. This button will always operate the cove lights in the room the button is located, and we will also operate in a synchronized fashion the cove lights in any other partition room in the partition area, provided the partition walls are open to those rooms. But the button will not operate the cove lights in any partition room that is closed off from this location by partition walls, allowing for independent lighting in those areas. Buttons in other rooms will operate their space the same way. If 2 rooms are combined, their buttons operate the same. Divided rooms act independent of each other. In order to accomplish this complex task in an extremely simple and powerful way, we've added a new device known as a partition group. Partition groups are created within the partition tab. I've already created the necessary partition groups for this space, one each for recessed, cove, and chandeliers. Since our example was a button operating the cove lights, let's take a look at the cove light partition group. Notice we have selected within each of the rooms the cove lights to be members of this group. Now, when we program a button to operate on cove lights, we select this partition group rather than the individual zones as the object of our action, and the button will affect those members of the partition group within the space open to the location of the button, and we'll ignore those shut off by walls. If we were to examine the other partition groups, we would see similar selection of the corresponding loads or loads in each room. Let's take a look at the Equinox interface and its representation of the partition area. I've added a commercial Equinox interface. I'm connected to the system and I have programmed it. So we'll open the emulator to see what you would see on the touchscreen. We come to something very familiar. The default. There's also a lighting widget. But now there's this new icon, which is our partition. Notice before we get into this that at the top left, the location currently is the ballroom, and that's because that's where I have placed the commercial Equinox interface object. But it also has in parentheses something new, which is a representation of the context of control. So for the default and the lighting widget, but that can be changed later, and as we'll see. Now, back to the partition widget icon. As we select this widget, we see a graphical representation of the partition area. The bar and zoom buttons on the right allow us to size the partition area graphical representation as we like. There are also 2 buttons over here, one of which will close all the walls and one of which will open all the walls. Now, of course, we want to be able to operate individual walls as well, and we can do that. Please notice the representation of the wall state. It's solid if it's closed, dashed if it's open, and then also there is the button in there that is a toggle. So this represents if I touch it, it will close it, and now it represents if I touch it, it will open. Notice that in each isolated space, the name of the first room in that space, and we always go top to bottom, left to right order. If all the rooms were isolated, then we see the names of all 4. But if we were to open all those walls, then we have just ballroom A representing the entire area. Now, if we close these two down, we'll see A and B together. We'll see C and D together. Now, notice also that there is going to be one space in the partition area that's highlighted in blue. This represents our context for the other widgets and should agree with the name of the location name. So if I just tap down here, I make this now my context, and we can see that represented in the location. Okay, now let's go to the lighting widget, and here we'll notice that we have first the partition groups listed, and we see that they're represented with a group icon, and then also we have the individual loads in the space as currently defined, and will not show those that are shut off by walls. Now if I operate in this area, the cove light, and turn them off, notice that the cove lights in that area follow. If I then go to ballroom A, you'll notice that the cove lights in this room are still on. If I want to operate those as a group, I can change what level they're at, and notice that the cove lights in that area follow. So this is independent. This representation of this group is independent in this space because it's closed off. Now I need the partition widget to view the current configuration. So you'll notice when I've selected an individual room, I don't have that widget. I need to go back to the top, and there's where I have it. And it's possible that we can give a user profile access to this or not to have it, so that they can change around and they can actually change they can operate the lighting without the ability to modify the partitioning if we take that away from them. As a side note, the Equinox 41 does not show the partition area graphic because there's no room in the partition in the portrait view. If we're using the Equinox app on a phone, it seems we'd have the same problem, but if you turn the phone horizontally, the app will switch to landscape mode and the area graphic will appear. So let's finish this introduction by creating a scene. I want the scene to be context aware, just like everything that we've done so far. So I'm going to operate the lights according to I'm going to use, as I mentioned before, our partition groups instead of individual loads. So I'm going to say we've got a scene here called banquet, and I'm going to do a ramp load action. I'm going to set the chandeliers to 50%. I'm going to set the cove lights to 80. And I'm going to set the recess to 20. I am going to also now assign this scene to the ballroom, the partition area, as well as each partition room, and save it. And now, as I have A and B separated, if I go into the scene widget and I operate the banquet scene, I am only making that banquet scene happen in room A and B together. Now, obviously, there may be a lot of cases where we do use different interfaces, something different than the Equinox touchscreen. So in the following video, we'll cover keypad and EQ40 user interfaces for partition spaces.